This week, Sony has started rolling out the new PlayStation Plus service in select territories with its various tiers including classic games, such as those for PlayStation, PlayStation 2, and the PSP. Thus far, however, the service is only available in certain Asian territories. Thankfully, we found a way around this and have spent some time testing the various releases currently available, and today, I'll be able to walk you through the state of PlayStation emulation running on PS5. Consider this a preview of sorts, however, as this doesn't necessarily represent what we'll see when it launches in the West, but it does give us some insight into its current functionality. So, how does it work? Well, once you sign up for the service, a new menu option becomes available with various categories, including classic games. Click on this and you'll see that currently, just a small handful of titles are available now, including games such as Tekken 2, Mr. Driller, Ape Escape, and more. There's also a handful of Jack titles available as PS2 classics and a single PSP game, the PSP port of Echochrome. Let's kick things off with a look at the PlayStation 1 emulation then. So if you remember, I didn't have a lot of positive things to say about the PlayStation Classic. The emulation was subpar and there were issues with the versions they selected for that unit. As best as I can tell though, it does seem like the PlayStation emulator included in these new releases is different from that of the PS Classic. It has new features and options including high resolution rendering, rewind, and more. When you go to download a game then, you're given the choice between PS5 and PS4 versions, presumably different packages. There aren't many games available initially, and some of the choices are a little strange, like 2 Worms games? Why? Still, Ape Escape is awesome. Wild Arms, Mr. Driller, Tekken 2, Oddworld, it's all good stuff. So in approaching this topic then, there were several key things I wanted to determine. Firstly, how is the quality of the emulation itself? Did they really use 50Hz PAL versions of certain games? If so, what effect does this have in practice? Also, how does it handle higher resolution interlaced content like Mr. Driller? And what sort of video options are included? I have answers to all these questions and more, so let's get into it. Let's begin with one of my favorites from this era, Ape Escape, or as some have called it, Ape Escape. This was a key title for the arrival of the DualShock analog controller requiring both sticks to function. You move the right stick to use various tools, including the net required to capture the apes. And yeah, this is the original Ape Club, except it's not boring. Unfortunately, when you first boot up the game, you'll notice mention of Sony Computer Entertainment Europe. Yeah, it looks like the PAL version, doesn't it? And this is confirmed by the ugly title screen logo as well. Watching the real-time introduction then, I was initially confused by the results I was seeing. Essentially, the frame rate didn't appear to be smooth to the eye, but our frame rate analysis tool was reporting 30 frames per second. That shouldn't be the case given that it's a PAL release, right? So what's going on? Well, check out the frame time graph here. Note how the frame times vary from lows of 50 milliseconds all the way up to 16 milliseconds. These gigantic lurches are responsible for the inconsistent frame persistence. It's basically incorrect frame pacing amplified to the max, and I have to admit, it looks pretty bad in motion. Once you get in the game though, it settles back down to 25 frames per second, as you'd expect from the PAL version. So what's going on here? My guess is that the cutscenes have special timing related to the pre-recorded audio that is perhaps causing this issue. Either something was adjusted for this release in the first place, or it's a side effect of running within a 60Hz container. And that really gets to the heart of the problem here, and the reason why PAL releases are a bad choice for a service like this. Essentially, the PS5 can only output a minimum of 60 Hz for games, but these games are made for 50 Hz displays. Since it no longer divides evenly into the refresh rate, there's no other option but to vary the length of time a frame is displayed, resulting in inconsistency and judder as we see. That's why during gameplay, the frame time graph is still a mess, though not quite like the introduction cutscene. Furthermore, games like Ape Escape were not properly optimized for the PAL region, at least not fully. So Take the intro sequence here. Compared to a real Japanese NTSC PlayStation console, the PS5 emulation does actually match the speed correctly, suggesting again that the cutscenes were modified to maintain audio sync. The difference comes down to fluidity of playback. It's a lot choppier on PS5. But if we run one of the game's attract demos, which shows actual gameplay, it's clear that the game speed itself was not altered, and it runs 17% slower on PlayStation 5. The demos quickly go out of sync as a result. The game just plays a lot better in its original NTSC format. So the PS5 emulation of Ape Escape not only plays in slow motion, it looks choppy while doing so. This is the problem. But here's the thing. We do not know for certain how the lineup will shake out in different territories. Other storefronts may opt for NTSC versions, for instance. Hopefully, this mistake is not made elsewhere. This problem only currently seems to apply to Sony first-party games included in the service. That means the titles such as Wild Arms, Jumping Flash, Kurushi, and Everybody's Golf are all presented using the PAL versions of the games. In this case, for each title, it means slower gameplay and juddery movement. It's not a good choice. There is one exception, however. Siphon Filter appears to be the US version. It mentions Sony Computer Entertainment America on the title screen, and as you can see from the frame rate graph, it runs at 20 frames per second. If it were PAL, it would be 18 instead. That said, it does have some frame pacing issues, but still, all the other games are PAL. One more PAL related thing then. Right before I was ready to export the video, Sony updated 3 of the games, including Everybody's Golf, Jumping Flash, and Kurushi. So what did they do? Well, they added frame blending to try to make up for the PAL frame rate, but this means that there's a ghost trail behind every frame. If I pause it for a moment, you can see what I mean. This does not make up for the low refresh rate of these PAL versions. I think it's clear that the reason Sony selected the PAL versions in this case though is down to language support, right? That's the obvious reason. Remember, European releases tend to offer localizations for up to 5 different languages, which can be appealing if you were selecting games for the service and weren't fully aware of the issues associated with using a PAL release on a 60Hz machine. The solution, I feel, can already be seen in something like Nintendo's online service on the Switch. They once dealt with the PAL issue in the past, of course, but now players can download different versions of the app for each region, but still just use one account to play each one. This allows full access to regional variants. It's something Sony should really consider in this case, allow access to those regional variants. This would effectively eliminate the PAL issue entirely, but if you wanted to play the PAL version, you still could, you just have the option for correct speed. Now, it should be noted that non-Sony games do actually seem to include the NTSC or American variants. Namco's releases, such as Tekken 2 and Mr. Driller for instance, are both presented at 60Hz, and both are worth a look as a result. The same is true of Toy Story 2, which is also the NTSC version and targets 30 frames per second. And honestly, at least in this intro section, it runs at a very stable 30 FPS. It's one of the smoothest games in this collection. Alas, Worms Armageddon is the PAL version like those other Sony first-party games, so yeah, it updates at 50Hz. To continue a look at the emulation though, you might have noticed by now that there's a boost in resolution during the Ape Escape comparisons, and this is something I'd like to discuss next. You see, unlike prior PS1 emulation solutions from Sony, this emulator draws the visuals at a higher resolution, though there are some additional options as well that we'll discuss in a moment related to how it's presented. Basically, in this case, polygon graphics are drawn at a higher rendering resolution. Specifically, when using a 4K output, you get around what seems to be 1920 by 1440-ish in Ape Escape. Conversely, non-3D elements are basically upscaled while preserving their pixel structure, which is a positive thing, at least they're not blurred. This new emulator also exacerbates the situation with warbling textures. Look at the wall here behind Spectre. Note how it's much less stable on PS5 compared to original hardware. So this is one of those matter of opinion things though. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of high resolution rendering for PlayStation 1 content, at least not without a very specific emulator feature, which I'll mention later. There's really 2 reasons for this. Firstly, the lack of floating point precision. Without subpixel accuracy, polygon models would essentially pop between pixels, leading to an unstable, wobbly appearance. Problem is, just boosting the rendering resolution doesn't actually change this, and the same limitations still apply. It's just that they become a lot more visible because everything's sharper. You'll see polygons pop between the virtual pixel grid much more clearly now. Secondly, I don't care much for the mismatch between low resolution assets, like the 3D objects, and things such as UI elements. Meshing high resolution polygon rendering with low resolution 2D always looks awkward, I think. Heck, in some cases, it gets even wilder. Jumping Flash, for instance, uses a software rendering trick for its ground surface. This basically sidesteps issues with polygon warbling, typical of PlayStation games since it's not a normal polygon-based surface. Problem is, this can't take advantage of higher resolution rendering, thus you end up with this juxtaposition of high-res models scattered around the scene, contrasted against this low-resolution surface. So while we're talking about rendering then, let's look at the performance in Tekken 2 then. This is an NTSC game that uses a non-interlaced output, right? You may have noticed that it does deliver 60 frames per second, but every 8 seconds there's a blip on the frame time graph. So what's this about? Well, in non-interlaced mode, the PlayStation outputs a signal of 59.826 Hz. The PS5 in contrast outputs 59.94 Hz instead. So I believe they're running the games at the original speed and simply converting them to a 5994 container, leading to occasional duplicate frames. It's not a big deal actually, and it's something you even see with upscalers using triple buffering as a solution, but it is something to note here. But what about games that used a high resolution interlaced mode? Mr. Driller and Intelligent Cube are actually two such games. And this is one area where I feel Sony has done a good job. The image quality is clean and presented at full resolution without any sort of interlacing or combing artifacts. They're drawing the native resolution of the artwork here. So this is one area where they've delivered exactly what I would have hoped for. But then we come to the visual mode options, and there's two categories here: filters and a pixel/aspect ratio option. So filter wise, we have three options here: default, retro classic, and modern. At first glance, default and modern basically look identical. The difference is that the modern mode seems to boost the contrast, leading to a much darker image. Retro Classic, however, introduces a scanline filter, and it looks okay at first glance, but it has some issues. So it softens the image, boosts the contrast, and then adds the scanline overlay to the mix. Problem is, it doesn't perfectly align with the game's pixel grid. So look closely at the lettering here. The scanline option slices right through certain pixels at the incorrect point. You can see how much more effective the scanline feature of something like the RetroTink 5X Pro is in comparison. A device, by the way, that was created by one person. Also worth noting, the Retro Classic mode doesn't actually work with Worms Armageddon. Instead, it simply darkens and blurs the image, but no scanlines appear, so kind of a strange little bug, I think. But once you dig into the aspect ratio options, things start to get a little bit strange. So by default it's okay. The emulator opts for this 4:3 within a 16:9 window, and it works as advertised. But where I take issue is with the 1:1 and square pixel options. Choose either one of these options and immediately you'll notice that the screen is squished. I'm not sure what these options actually correspond to, but it doesn't match the PlayStation's pixel grid at all, as both options render narrow pixels, resulting in the aforementioned squished image. And in fact, that's a real problem. There's no way to actually get proper, evenly scaled square pixels on PS5. Of course, many of these games are PAL versions, which do have a different resolution from the NTSC versions, but these same issues all exist with the NTSC versions of the games as well. The same narrow aspect ratio in 1:1 and square pixel mode, and weird scaling issues. I suspect this is the result of trying to fill the screen, but that's what these options should have been used to correct in the first place. They just don't work right. So basically, none of the scaling or display options are well implemented, nor do they perform as the names would imply. It almost feels as if they were designed by somebody that didn't fully understand what these options represent in other products and implemented them here in some strange way. There are some other modes as well. There's the native resolution option, which isn't actually the native resolution, but it does shrink it down to a much smaller window. There's also the option to stretch the image to fill the entire 16:9 viewport. And lastly, a 4:3 option within a 16:10 window, which is kind of curious but could potentially have use on a monitor. So lastly, what about native PS4 versions of these downloads? After all, both options are provided, right? Ultimately, the difference appears to be minimal in terms of actual functionality. The controller overlay at boot differs, but that's about all I could detect. But that's basically the state of PS1 emulation on PS5. There are some good things here, but also some missteps. This is the first time Sony has opted for actually enhancing games, but they didn't take it far enough. And since this is a per game feature, I'd have liked to have seen something along the lines of the PGXP option from DuckStation implemented, or at least offer the option to run at original resolution with perfectly scaled pixels to 4K. PGXP, by the way, is the feature that solves many of the display issues that PlayStation games suffer from. It allows for perspective correct textures and solves the subpixel issues. But enough about the original PlayStation. What about PlayStation Portable? Well, alas, there's only one game to test here, and it's Echochrome. I like Echochrome, but it's a strange choice, especially since I was just playing this on PlayStation 3 at 1080p with 4x MSAA. This does, however, confirm some things about PSP emulation. So firstly, 3D rendering does receive a boost up to 1080p, it seems, from the system's 480x272 native resolution. 2D elements, however, are simply upscaled and filtered, resulting in this super blurry looking artwork. It wouldn't be a huge problem in every case, but it does mean, potentially, any 2D games released in the service will look very poor with ultra blurry image quality, so I hope they provide a sharp scale option. Secondly, the scaling and display options are extremely weird for PSP. So firstly, the Retro Classic mode simply enables the same scan lines as PS1. The PSP uses an LCD panel though. There's no reason to simulate scan lines for these games. There should be at least a dot matrix filter or no filter at all, but scan lines? Very strange. The other display options then are largely illogical, such as 1:1 pixel or square pixel mode. Once again, you're presented with this super narrow image, but the PSP's native pixel resolution is actually 16:9. It's 480x272 pixels. Square pixels should retain this aspect ratio, not present a squished image. There's really never a reason to squish the image for PSP games, in fact. Why is this here? There isn't much more I can say about PSP emulation just yet, however, given that we only have this one game to test. It is promising, but let's wait and see how it shakes out with more visually interesting games. Now, lastly, I want to briefly mention the PS2 emulation. Essentially, we're seeing those same PS2 classics from PS4 on PS5, but there's no native PS5 application here. It is running in backwards compatibility mode. The thing is, many of those classics didn't actually run correctly on PS5 in the first place. So how does it fare now? So currently, you have access to the three main Jak and Daxter titles plus Jak X Combat Racing. They seem to deliver the same image quality as the PS2 classics on PS4. Now for science, I decided to try out the limited run games release of Jak and Daxter on disc, which is actually just a PS2 classic for PS4. I installed it on the PS5 without any patches, and it seems to behave identically to the new version via PlayStation Plus. So it's unclear if any underlying changes were actually made in terms of solving emulation glitches with non-Jak games. Alas, even when functioning correctly, the performance is still worse than a real PlayStation 2, and you can really see this on the main title screen. On a real PS2, pay close attention. This flyby sequence behind the logo plays out without any performance hiccups. It's a smooth, locked 60 frames per second. It looks excellent. On PS5, however, most of the sequence just runs at half rate or 30 frames per second. Alas, because this game uses interlaced rendering, it does change the image every single frame, even if the 3D is not updated at 60 FPS, so our tools can't measure it. But hopefully you can see what I mean. Beyond that, the games all play as they did before. The resolution receives a minor boost, but the emulation is otherwise unremarkable and seemingly unchanged. I should mention that the PS1 and PSP emulation did both offer users the option to rewind, which is very useful indeed, and save their game to one of the save state slots. These are great features, but still absent for PS2 classics. I'll be curious to see if other PS2 games, which currently aren't PS5 compatible, are updated to work properly with the new hardware for this service, or if they'll simply avoid releasing them altogether. But that's basically the state of emulation of classic PlayStation systems on the PS5. Right now, I'd say there is still a lot of work to be done, but it's not something that's unsalvageable. I only hope that the team responsible for these releases considers some of the issues presented in this and other videos and looks to improve the results going forward. As for me, I'll be sticking with original hardware of course, but I hope other users have a chance to enjoy these games in the future with improved emulation quality. We'll keep you updated on any future changes though, but that's going to do it for this video, so thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe, follow us over on Twitter, and we'll see you next time.